When we talk about nuclear risk in the context of Iran, it's important to move beyond the simplistic question of whether or not a bomb already exists. Because in today's strategic environment, the more consequential issue is capability, the ability to build a nuclear weapon relatively quickly if the decision were made to do so. And that's what we mean when we talk about a threshold state. Iran sits in that category. Now, what does that actually mean in practical terms? It means Iran has developed a sophisticated nuclear infrastructure over many years. It has enriched uranium to levels that are significantly closer to weapons grade than what is required for civilian energy purposes. It has advanced centrifuge technology. It has accumulated technical knowledge and human capital that cannot be easily reversed. And importantly, it has built these capabilities under conditions of international pressure, sanctions, and periodic inspections. So we're not talking about a country starting from scratch. We're talking about a system that already exists, already functions, and already has the core components required for nuclear breakout if the political decision is made. And that distinction matters because the existence of capability changes the nature of the strategic equation. It creates what we might call latent power, power that is not yet activated but is real enough to influence behavior, shape perceptions, and alter calculations on all sides. Now, from Iran's perspective, the development of this capability is not just a technical achievement. It is deeply strategic in a region where threats are perceived as constant and where military imbalances are significant. Nuclear capability, whether actual or potential, functions as a form of deterrence. It raises the cost of external intervention. It signals resilience, and it creates leverage in negotiations. But here's where the psychology becomes important, because deterrence is not just about what you can do, it's about what others believe you might do. And that belief is inherently unstable. It depends on interpretation, on signals, on rhetoric, on past behavior. And in a high tension environment, those interpretations can diverge significantly. One side may see restraint, another may see preparation. One side may believe deterrence is working, another may believe escalation is necessary to prevent future risk. And that divergence is where the danger lies. Because when perceptions are misaligned, decisions can be made on incomplete or incorrect assumptions. Now, Iran has also taken steps that have increased uncertainty in the system. There have been periods where cooperation with international monitoring bodies has been reduced or suspended. These actions, whether intended as strategic signaling or domestic political positioning, have an effect. They reduce transparency. And when transparency decreases, uncertainty increases. And in nuclear strategy, uncertainty is not neutral. It is destabilizing. Because if you don't know exactly what your counterpart is capable of or how close they are to crossing a threshold, you are forced to make decisions under conditions of incomplete information. And that tends to push actors toward worst-case assumptions. That's the paradox of threshold states. They are not nuclear armed, but they are close enough to influence nuclear thinking. And that proximity can create pressure on all sides. For Iran, there is the pressure to maintain capability without crossing the line that would trigger severe consequences. And for other regional and global actors, there is the pressure to prevent that capability from becoming weaponized, sometimes through diplomatic means, sometimes through coercive measures, and in extreme cases through military action. So you have a system that is inherently tense, not because a nuclear weapon exists, but because the possibility of one exists and is taken seriously by all relevant actors. Now, let's take a step back and think about what this does to the broader strategic environment. In traditional deterrence theory, nuclear weapons are often seen as stabilizing once they exist. The logic is that mutual assured destruction reduces the likelihood of direct conflict between nuclear powers. But before that point is reached, in the transition phase, things are often less stable. Because that's when thresholds are ambiguous. That's when signals are being tested. That's when capabilities are being developed but not declared. That's when actions are interpreted in multiple ways at once. And that ambiguity creates risk. Not necessarily of intentional nuclear use, but of miscalculation, of escalation spirals, of decisions made under pressure that were meant to be defensive but are perceived as offensive. And this is where leadership matters. Because in moments like this, decisions are not just technical, they are psychological. They are shaped by fear, by history, by domestic pressure, by perceptions of strength and weakness. And in systems where communication is limited or mistrusted, those psychological factors can dominate. So when we ask whether this conflict could turn nuclear, the more precise question is, under what conditions would the threshold be crossed, either intentionally or unintentionally? And the answer is not straightforward, because it depends on multiple moving parts. It depends on military dynamics, on political decisions, on international responses, and on how each actor interprets the intentions of the others. What we can say with confidence is this: as long as a country remains in a threshold position, the risk is not binary, it is continuous. It doesn't switch from safe to dangerous overnight. It evolves. And that evolution can accelerate under certain conditions: heightened conflict, breakdowns in diplomacy, increased external pressure, or internal political shifts, which means that managing this risk is not about eliminating uncertainty entirely. That's not possible. It's about managing it carefully through communication, through verification, through restraint, and through an understanding that in a threshold environment, even small decisions can have large consequences. Because once a system reaches the point where capability, perception, and intent intersect, the margin for error becomes very small. And that leads to the core insight here. Nuclear risk in this context is not just about weapons. It's about the space between capability and decision. And how that space is managed, carefully or carelessly, will determine whether that capability remains dormant or becomes something far more consequential. So the real question is not just whether Iran can build a nuclear weapon. It's whether the system surrounding that capability is stable enough to ensure that it never becomes inevitable. And if that system begins to fail, the consequences won't just be regional. They will be global and irreversible. When we talk about deterrence in this context, we often reduce it to a simple equation: strength equals safety. The idea that if a state has enough capability or the perception of capability, it can prevent others from taking action against it. But in reality, deterrence is far more complex. It's not just about military power. It's about psychology. It's about perception. And most importantly, it's about credibility. Because deterrence only works if it is believed. Now, when we look at Iran's strategic position, we see a state that is constantly navigating between signaling strength and avoiding full-scale escalation. That balance is not easy to maintain. On one hand, there is a desire to demonstrate capability, to show that the country is not vulnerable, that it can defend itself, that it can impose costs if necessary. On the other hand, there is a need to avoid crossing thresholds that would trigger overwhelming retaliation or international isolation. And that balancing act is inherently unstable, because signaling strength can sometimes be interpreted as escalation, and restraint can sometimes be interpreted as weakness. So every action becomes a signal, and every signal carries risk. This is where rhetoric becomes important. Statements made by political leaders, military officials, or state institutions are not just communication. They are part of the strategic environment. They are read, carefully analyzed, and interpreted by multiple audiences, domestic, regional, and global. And in a high-tension context, even small shifts in language can be significant. A more assertive statement might be intended to reinforce deterrence, but it can also increase anxiety on the other side. A more restrained tone might be intended to de-escalate, but it can also be perceived as hesitation. So you have a situation where communication itself becomes a tool of strategy and a potential source of miscalculation. Now let's add another layer: international frameworks. Iran's relationship with organizations like the IAEA is central to how its nuclear activities are perceived. These frameworks are designed to provide transparency, to verify compliance, and to build confidence among states. But when that cooperation is reduced or interrupted, even partially, it creates gaps in information. And in nuclear strategy, gaps are dangerous, because when information is incomplete, assumptions fill the void. Other actors may begin to assume worst-case scenarios, that enrichment is advancing faster than reported, that certain capabilities are being developed in secrecy, that timelines are shorter than expected, and those assumptions can influence policy decisions, sometimes in ways that increase tension rather than reduce it. So cooperation is not just about compliance, it's about trust. And trust in this environment is a strategic asset. But here's the challenge: trust is difficult to build and easy to lose. It requires consistency over time. It requires transparency. It requires that commitments are not only made, but maintained. And when that trust is eroded even slightly, the entire system becomes more fragile. Because now every action is viewed through a lens of skepticism. And skepticism changes behavior. It leads to closer monitoring, to more cautious diplomacy, to contingency planning, and in some cases, to preemptive thinking. Now let's think about how this plays out in a broader sense. When one side believes that the other is closer to achieving a nuclear breakout, even if that perception is not fully accurate, it can create pressure to act. Not necessarily immediately, but as part of a longer-term strategic adjustment, because no state wants to be in a position where it is strategically outmatched. So perception becomes a driver of policy. And that's important to understand, because in many cases, decisions are not based solely on what is objectively true. They are based on what is believed to be true, and in a high-stakes environment, that distinction can be critical. This is where misperception becomes one of the greatest risks, If one side underestimates the other's capabilities, it may act too aggressively. And if it overestimates those capabilities, it may act too cautiously or take preemptive measures that escalate tensions unnecessarily. Either way, the outcome is the same: increased instability. And when you combine misperception with uncertainty, you create a system that is inherently volatile. Now, let's bring this back to Iran's position. Iran's leadership operates within a complex set of incentives. There is a desire to maintain sovereignty, to deter external pressure, and to strengthen regional influence. But there is also an awareness of the consequences of crossing certain thresholds, and so decisions are made within constraints. But those constraints are not always visible to outside observers, which means that others may misinterpret intent, and when intent is misinterpreted, the risk of escalation increases. This is the core of the deterrence dilemma, because deterrence depends on clarity. But the environment in which it operates is often ambiguous, and ambiguity creates space for error. So what we are really dealing with is a system that is trying to balance on a narrow edge between signaling and restraint, between capability and perception, between deterrence and escalation. And that balance is not guaranteed. It requires constant calibration. It requires communication channels that remain open. It requires mechanisms for verification and de-escalation. And it requires an understanding that actions in this space have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate moment. Because once nuclear capability enters the equation, even as a possibility, the stakes change fundamentally. Now, every move is interpreted not just in terms of immediate impact, but in terms of long-term implications. And that changes the logic of the system. So the real question is not whether Iran intends to use nuclear weapons. The question is whether the system surrounding Iran is stable enough to prevent that capability from ever being used. And that depends on something very fragile: perception. Because in the end, deterrence is not about weapons alone. It is about what others believe you will do with them. And if that belief breaks down, the entire structure begins to shift, quietly at first, and then all at once. When we think about escalation in a conflict like this, it's tempting to imagine a clear sequence: one action followed by a response, followed by a measured counter-response. But in reality, escalation rarely behaves that cleanly. It's nonlinear, it's cumulative, and most importantly, it's shaped by uncertainty as much as by intent. And that's where the real risk emerges. Because when you introduce military action near sensitive nuclear infrastructure, you are not just targeting physical assets. You are entering a domain where miscalculation becomes significantly more dangerous. Nuclear facilities are not ordinary targets. They are part of a highly sensitive system, one that operates under strict technical constraints and ideally international oversight. But in a conflict environment, those constraints become harder to guarantee. Let's think about what happens when military pressure increases around these sites. On a tactical level, the objective may be to degrade capabilities, to delay progress, to signal resolve, to impose costs. But from the perspective of the system as a whole, each strike, each disruption introduces a variable that wasn't there before. And variables in a high-stakes environment create instability. Because nuclear systems are not designed to absorb shock in the way conventional systems might be. They require stability, predictability, and careful management. When those conditions are disrupted, whether through direct strikes, cyber interference, or collateral damage, the risks begin to accumulate. Now, here's where the psychological dimension becomes critical. In moments of heightened tension, leaders are not just responding to events, they are interpreting them. And those interpretations are influenced by perception, by past experience, by domestic pressure, and by expectations of what the other side might do next. So when a facility is targeted, the question is not just what was hit, but why it was hit. Was this a warning, a deterrent, a precursor to something larger? And how that question is answered internally shapes the response. Because in these environments, signals are rarely perfectly clear, and ambiguity can be dangerous. Let's consider the example of targeting nuclear-related infrastructure. Even if a strike is highly precise, even if it avoids critical components, the act itself sends a message. It says that these sites are not immune, that they can be reached, that they are within the scope of military planning, and that message has consequences. For the targeted state, it reinforces vulnerability. It can increase the perceived need to accelerate capabilities, to harden systems, or to reconsider strategic posture. For other actors watching, it raises concerns about escalation thresholds, about how far the conflict might go and what actions might follow next. So what you get is not just a tactical exchange, you get a feedback loop. Each action influences perception, each perception influences future action. And over time, this can create a dynamic where the system becomes increasingly sensitive to disruption. Now, add to that the risk of miscalculation. In any military environment, there is always a margin for error. Intelligence can be incomplete, signals can be misread, intentions can be misunderstood. But when nuclear-related infrastructure is involved, the consequences of those errors increase dramatically, because now the stakes are not just about conventional damage. They are about the possibility, however remote, of triggering a chain reaction that leads to a much larger crisis. And this is where history offers a cautionary lesson. We have seen in previous conflicts how close calls can occur, not because of deliberate escalation, but because of misinterpretation, technical error, or decision-making under pressure. In each case, the system held, but not without risk. And what's important to understand is that those systems were in many ways less complex than the one we're dealing with today. Today's environment includes advanced military technologies, cyber capabilities, AI-assisted targeting, and real-time information flows, all of which increase speed, but also increase complexity. And complexity, in turn, increases the likelihood of unintended consequences. So when we talk about escalation risk in this context, we are not just talking about intent. We are talking about interaction, how systems respond to each other, how signals are interpreted, how pressure accumulates over time, and how, under the right or wrong conditions, those interactions can produce outcomes that no single actor intended. This is what makes nuclear-adjacent conflict so dangerous. It operates in a space where thresholds are not always clearly defined, where actions can be interpreted in multiple ways, and where the line between deterrence and escalation can blur. And once that line begins to blur, the system becomes more fragile, because now decisions are being made not just based on capability, but on perception of intent and on fear of what might come next. And fear in high-stakes environments can accelerate decision-making, not always in a rational direction, sometimes toward caution, sometimes toward escalation, sometimes toward preemptive action, which brings us to a difficult reality. In a system like this, stability depends not just on what you do, but on how what you do is understood by others. And if that understanding is incomplete or incorrect, the risk of unintended escalation increases. So the challenge is not just to avoid conflict. It is to manage it in a way that minimizes ambiguity, reduces misinterpretation, and keeps actions within clearly understood boundaries. But that is easier said than done, because in a conflict environment, clarity is often the first casualty. And as clarity decreases, risk increases. So when we look at the current dynamics, the key question is not simply whether escalation will happen. It is whether the system is resilient enough to absorb pressure without crossing critical thresholds, because once those thresholds are crossed, especially in proximity to nuclear infrastructure, the consequences are no longer reversible. And that is the core of the risk, not inevitability, but proximity. And how we manage that proximity will determine whether escalation remains contained or becomes something far more difficult to control. When we step back and look at the broader implications of this conflict, it becomes clear that the nuclear question is not just about one country or even one region. It is about the structure of the international system itself, how it holds together, how it adapts, and how it responds when pressure is applied. Because if this conflict moves even incrementally toward a nuclear dimension, whether through capability, signaling, or miscalculation, the effects will not remain contained. They will spread. And that's where the real concern lies, not just in the immediate risk, but in the systemic consequences that follow. Let's start with the global non-proliferation regime. For decades, the world has operated under a framework designed to limit the spread of nuclear weapons. It's not perfect, and it has always depended on a balance between enforcement, incentives, and trust. But it has, for the most part, held. Now, imagine that framework being tested, not just by one state moving closer to capability, but by a conflict that normalizes that movement. If one country demonstrates that it can approach nuclear capability while remaining outside of the formal nuclear weapons club, others will take notice, not necessarily because they want nuclear weapons, but because they want options. And in international politics, options are power. So the question becomes, if this path works for one state, why not for others? And that is how proliferation begins, not always with a sudden decision, but with gradual shifts in perception, because states don't make these decisions in isolation. They watch each other, they learn from each other, and they respond to changes in the strategic environment. Now, add another layer, regional dynamics. In the Middle East, security is already highly interdependent. There are long-standing rivalries, shifting alliances, and deep historical grievances. In such an environment, the introduction or even the perceived introduction of nuclear capability changes the calculus for everyone involved. If one state is believed to be moving closer to a nuclear threshold, others may begin to reconsider their own strategic posture, not immediately, not explicitly, But gradually, they may invest more in missile defense. They may strengthen conventional forces. They may deepen alliances with external powers. And in some cases, they may begin to explore their own nuclear options, not because they want conflict, but because they want deterrence. And that's the paradox. Nuclear capability, or even the pursuit of it, is often framed as a stabilizing force. But in regions where multiple actors feel insecure, it can have the opposite effect. It can trigger a cascade of responses, each intended to restore balance, but collectively increasing tension. This is how security dilemmas unfold. One state seeks to become more secure. Others interpret that move as a threat. They respond accordingly. And the cycle continues. Now, let's think about how this affects the broader international system. Because this is not just a regional issue. It sends a signal globally. It tells other states that the boundaries of nuclear behavior may be shifting, that the thresholds may be more flexible than previously assumed, that enforcement may be inconsistent, and that the strategic environment is more fluid than the frameworks designed to govern it. And when that perception takes hold, it can weaken the credibility of the entire system, because global governance relies on shared expectations, on rules that are understood, respected, and enforced. And when those expectations are challenged, even in one case, it can create doubt elsewhere, and doubt spreads. Now let's bring in the role of great powers. The response of major actors, whether they are involved directly or indirectly, shapes the trajectory of this situation, because their actions signal how the system should interpret and respond to nuclear-related developments. If responses are coordinated and consistent, they reinforce norms. If responses are fragmented or inconsistent, they create ambiguity, and ambiguity, as we've discussed, increases risk. But here's where it gets more complex. Great powers are not just responding to one another. They are responding to domestic pressures, to economic considerations, to strategic priorities that extend beyond this specific conflict, which means their actions are not always aligned. And that misalignment can create gaps in enforcement, gaps in messaging, gaps in expectations. And those gaps can be exploited. So what we have is a system that is under pressure from multiple directions: technological pressure, political pressure, strategic pressure, and now potentially nuclear pressure, and each layer interacts with the others. Because cyber operations, military actions, and information campaigns don't exist in isolation. They influence how nuclear risks are perceived, they shape the environment in which decisions are made, and they contribute to the overall level of tension. So when we ask whether this conflict could lead to broader nuclear instability, the answer is not a simple yes or no. It is a question of trajectory, because what matters is not just the current state of affairs. It is the direction in which the system is moving. Are we moving toward greater transparency or less? Toward more cooperation or more confrontation? Toward clearer rules or more ambiguity? And the answers to those questions will determine whether the non-proliferation regime holds or begins to erode. Because once erosion begins, it is difficult to reverse. Trust, once weakened, takes time to rebuild. Norms, once challenged, take time to reestablish. And perceptions, once altered, are hard to correct. So the stakes are not just about this conflict. They are about the future structure of global security, and whether the systems we rely on to manage nuclear risk are strong enough to withstand the pressures they are now facing. Because if they are not, the consequences will extend far beyond any single region. They will redefine how the world thinks about power, about security, and about the limits of conflict. And that brings us to the central insight. The real danger is not just the possibility of nuclear weapons being used, it is the gradual weakening of the systems that are meant to prevent that outcome. Because once those systems begin to fail, even slightly, the margin for error disappears. And in a world like that, stability is no longer something we can assume. It is something that must be actively maintained every day by every actor in every decision. And if that effort falters, even for a moment, the consequences may be irreversible.